Thank you, Brother Abbott and Brother Friar Abbott. Friar Abbott. Thank you all for coming this morning. It's wonderful to see all of you. One way or another, I've seen most of you come by the table. Many of you have asked about my health. I was reminded of a remark that Woody Allen made when he said that I don't want to become immortal through my work. I want to become immortal through not dying. And I've been through some health issues this year, but the good news is I'm over those, and I appreciate everyone that stopped by to ask. The search for symbolism and origins of the craft can be a torturous trip at times. When I was researching my 2006 book, Solomon's Builders, I was reading Bob Arnback's Through a Fiery Trial, a mind-numbingly detailed account of the building of America's new federal city. In the stories of the tumultuous year of 1793, I came across a reference that leapt off the page, screaming, "Symbolism alert." In colonial days, the first solid ground on the marshy north shore of Washington's Potomac River, just north of where the Lincoln Memorial stands today, was an outcropping of rocks jutting into the river. On several old maps, it's cryptically labeled the Key of All Keys. And for many years, it bore a surveyor's benchmark. But its more popular name was Braddock's Rock, reportedly because British General Braddock and his red-coated soldiers, accompanied by the young British Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, landed there in 1755. Washington had become a Freemason less than 2 years before. During colonial times, the hillside above Braddock's Rock was known to the few people nearby as Observatory Hill, it being a great place from which to spot potential incoming enemy naval vessels moving up the Potomac. British naval ships frequently docked there to offload troops and supplies. Eventually, in 1844, the old Naval Observatory was built on top of it. The old observatory stands in what is now the Navy Bureau of Medicine and Surgery complex just north of the Lincoln Memorial. The building is directly up the hill from the Key of All Keys. The original dome of the observatory can still be seen. It was here that astronomer Asaph Hall discovered the moons of Mars in 1877, the year before the Washington Monument was completed. About 1832, when the old C&O Canal was extended below Georgetown to connect with Washington City Canal, nearly all that was left of the original Braddock's Rock was blasted away. All the riverside swamps have long since been filled in, and the land has been raised above the level of the original surface in an attempt to escape the constant malarial fevers that plague the district. These days, all that remains of the rock itself is at the bottom of a well near the Kennedy Center beside the access ramp from Constitution Avenue to the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge on the way into Virginia. Hundreds of commuters drive past the round stone entrance every day without ever giving the Key of All Keys a second glance. But I knew it had to be a whole lot more than just an abandoned well. At this point, I was so excited I didn't know which way was up. I just knew that the Key of All Keys was some kind of esoteric reference. It had astronomical connections, it had Masonic connections, it was in the nation's capital. Most important, it had what was undoubtedly an occult name that just had to mean something big. Adding to its Masonic allure, its location directly east of what was Mason's Island, now Roosevelt Island, named after Freemason Teddy Roosevelt. Better yet, the rock was chipped away and used as foundation stones by Masonic architect James Hoban for both the White House and the Capitol building, both of which had cornerstones laid by the Freemasons, which means both keys contain jigsaw puzzle pieces from the Key of All Keys. With understandable excitement, I persevered through one windy article or journal after another in my lone quest to decipher what I was convinced was one of the lost esoteric secrets of Freemasonry and the founding of Washington, D.C. itself. I discovered a book called The Royal Secret, written in 1923 by Freemason Edward Clark. An entire chapter was devoted to a very different Key of All Keys. Clark wrote, quote, "The swastika is the key of all keys, and a knowledge of the numerals of the Hebrew alphabet is necessary to unravel the mysteries attached therein." Terrific. I hadn't anticipated a Jewish swastika. It was another small setback, even if the swastika in 1923 hadn't yet acquired its creepier, more sinister reputation. Still, I knew there had to be a symbolic explanation, and I knew I was on the trail of a very big secret, one that even Dan Brown hadn't uncovered. At last I discovered a crushingly anticlimactic explanation of the key from Williams Bogart Bryan in his 1914 History of the Nation's Capital. He explained it was simply a variation of the phrase, quay of all quays. I remembered then on holiday in the Bahamas, I saw the local residents outing tourists by their pronunciation of the word quay. Islanders always pronounced it key, just like the Florida Keys. Such are the shifting sands of the history of pronunciation. So after weeks of research and pondering and searching for an occult meaning behind an intriguing and obscure reference, the key of all keys turned out to be just a very big rock that was a really good place to tie up your boat. Or as Freud famously said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Which brings me to the real topic of this paper, the many claims and references to ancient Egypt throughout Masonry's history. Most non-Masons think the unfinished pyramid on the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States, as seen on the back of the dollar bill, is a Masonic symbol. In the opening sequence of the 2005 film National Treasure, kindly old Christopher Plummer playing Grandpa Treasure Hunter, Grandpa Gates tells his grandson that the Freemasons put it there on the back of the dollar bill. Well, unfortunately, it isn't true. In 1884, Harvard professor Eliot Norton wrote that the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye on the reverse of the Great Seal of the United States, quote, can hardly, however artistically treated by the designer, look otherwise than as a dull emblem of a Masonic fraternity, unquote. This is most probably the source of the mistaken belief that it's a Masonic symbol. Pyramids don't play a role in Masonic symbolism found in the degrees of the Masonic Lodge, the York Rite, or the Scottish Rite. Pyramids, finished or unfinished, are not necessarily Masonic symbols. Dan Brown's storyline in The Lost Symbol involving a secret stone pyramid with a gold capstone is pure fiction. We don't revere pyramids, worship them, or carry them around in our lumpy backpacks when we go to visit Washington, D.C. And yet, Masons have been through periods of Egypt mania when it comes to our lodge rooms and buildings. The George Washington Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia is based on a fanciful imaginary design of the famed lighthouse of the port of Alexandria, Egypt, built between 280 and 247 BC on the island of Pharos. The real lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood 450 feet tall and was the tallest building in the world for centuries. It was destroyed by an earthquake in 1323. Alexandria was also once home to the famed lost library of the Ptolemies. So when it came time to build the Washington Masonic Memorial, Masons couldn't resist the idea of a new lighthouse on top of the tallest hill of Virginia's Alexandria, which would also house a library. Across the Potomac in Washington, the Scottish Rite's House of the Temple is also filled with Egyptian and Sumerian influences. Masonic temples in California, Texas, Iowa, Michigan, and more have been built over the years, mostly in the 1920s, to look like Egyptian temples. There are certainly such things as Egyptian-themed Masonic lodge rooms, such as our Red Cross room in Indianapolis, and the incredible Egyptian-themed lodge rooms in Philadelphia and Detroit. Another notable one is Naval Lodge No. 4 in Washington, D.C., a few blocks from the Capitol on Pennsylvania Avenue. They chose to decorate their lodge room in Egyptian motif because their members helped to drag the original cornerstone of the Egyptian-inspired Washington Monument from the city's dock to its work site. As classical Greek styles had in the 1700s, Egyptian-influenced architecture first became popular in the 1800s. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 put the world in an absolute Egyptian frenzy, and the coming of Napoleon was really the beginning of modern archaeology. For the first time in almost 3,000 years of amazed tourists who stood in awe of Egypt's wonders while sailing up the Nile, Napoleon actually sent scientists and artists to study them and attempt to decipher what they saw. Interest grew more when news came to Europe of the discovery of Queen Hatshepsut's temple and the mummies of pharaohs at Dar el-Bahari in the 1860s. Egypt mania returned again in the early 20th century when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun and its dazzling artifacts. It was the major inspiration behind Art Deco architecture, art, and design in the 1930s. Suddenly, everything from banks and gas stations to post offices and movie theaters were laden with Egyptian-inspired Art Deco details. The Freemasons got into the act with Philadelphia's Grand Lodge building, Detroit's Masonic Temple, Indiana Freemasons Hall, and dozens, if not hundreds, more. And yet there is no Egyptianist symbolism in regular recognized craft Freemasonry as practiced in the U.S. and the bulk of the Masonic world. So where did it come from? In 1713, a French abbot named Jean Terrasson published a 3-volume romantic novel called Sethos about ancient Egypt. Europeans were just beginning to explore the ruins of Egypt, and everywhere they looked they saw hieroglyphics. In those days, no one was able to decipher what the strange carvings said, which meant a clever novelist could claim they were mystic, occult symbols used by Egyptian priests to conjure up magical spells, which is exactly what Terrasson did. His trilogy tells of a prince who undergoes 3 trials, is initiated into the mysterious worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis, and is taught the ideals of brotherhood, truth, justice, and knowledge, all of which sounds very similar to Freemasonry. The story was an enormous hit. Appearing during the height of the Age of Enlightenment, the idea captivated many philosophers, and not all of them took it to be fiction. Lots of Masons fell in love with the notion of the mystery schools of Egypt as Terrasson had described them. In fact, in his Constitutions of 1723, the first modern document of speculative Freemasonry, Reverend James Anderson wrote, quote, "And no doubt the royal art was brought down to Egypt by Mizraim, the second son of Ham, about 6 years after the confusion at Babel, and after the flood 160 years, when he led thither his colony. For Egypt is Mizraim in Hebrew, because we find the river Nile overflowing its banks soon caused an improvement in geometry, which consequently brought masonry in much request." Carl Friedrich von Kappen founded a little-known order of the African architects around 1763. Its degrees claimed the first Grand Master of Freemasonry was the biblical character of Ham, who went to Egypt and took the name Menes. There he supposedly received secret knowledge that was passed down through the centuries, eventually to Herr Kappen. It was divided into 2 temples having 11 degrees. Kappen appears to have started the order in opposition to the rite of strict observance. An Egyptian rite was founded in Naples, Italy in 1777, and its most famous purveyor was Giuseppe Balsamo, better known to history as Count Alessandro di Cagliostro. A notorious character in the years just before the French Revolution who got himself wrapped up in a royal scandal with Marie Antoinette over a diamond necklace, Cagliostro claimed to have lived for 2,000 years. A self-styled magician, he told the tale that he had been initiated into the Egyptian rite at the base of the Great Pyramid in Giza. He died imprisoned in Italy's fortress of San Leo after being sentenced to death, reduced to a life sentence by the Pope, by the Inquisition for being a Freemason. In 1789, Ignaz von Born, a member of a lodge in Vienna, Austria, published an essay comparing Masonic ritual to similarities in Egyptian ceremonies. Now, never mind that no one really knew exactly what those Egyptian ceremonies were. A combination of Sethos and von Born's essays, along with some German fairy tales and some Masonic themes, influenced his lodge brother Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. Yet most Masons today who watch or listen to the Magic Flute recognize very little having to do with the Freemasonry they know. In the 1800s, 2 Egyptian-influenced Masonic-style degree systems, the Rite of Memphis and the Rite of Mizraim, were created in France, that became largely money-making schemes for their promoters. Both rites had more than 90 different degrees, and in both cases they were peddled mostly as enterprises selling lavish diplomas with high-sounding titles for lots of ready cash. The more ancient, exotic, and mysterious the rituals became, the more they were lapped up by excited initiates, and it was hard to get more ancient and exotic than the land of the pharaohs. These rites were shut down by the government of France as well as the country's largest Grand Lodge, the Grand Orient of France, but they never really died out until their inventors passed on. These rituals have been dug up and re-emerged on the internet, but they are not part of the accepted Masonic world. Some have claimed that the all-seeing eye found on Masonic art in some lodges in place of the letter G is in fact descended from the Egyptian eye of Horus. The letter G is in our lodges. The letter G in our lodges is the initial of both geometry and God, or the grand architect of the universe. Early stonemasons believed that the sacred science of geometry had been given to the masons of the Bible's great building projects by God himself. The understanding of math, engineering, and construction was all wrapped up together in the package of geometry. It was considered so magical that it had to have been divinely inspired, and not just anyone could master it. In fact, during the Middle Ages, the French word, mystère, came to mean a trade or craft. Like the cathedrals built by the operative stonemason guilds, modern Freemasons unite the concepts of God and geometry, fusing faith with science. In most North American lodges, the G appears over the master's chair and is generally illuminated when the lodge is open. But in lodges in non-English speaking countries, the words for geometry and God frequently don't begin with G, and in countries that use a completely different alphabet, the letter G may not exist at all. Therefore, the all-seeing eye is used to represent God, and it frequently appears inside of an illuminated equilateral triangle. The triangle represents the mathematical perfection of geometry, though its origins as a Christian symbol for God can be traced back for centuries to the Renaissance and even before, with the three sides representing the Christian Trinity. The first appearance of the all-seeing eye as a published Masonic symbol used in the ritual ceremonies of the time seemed to be in Thomas Smith Webb's Freemason's Monitor, published in 1797. However, the all-seeing eye does appear on hand-painted or hand-embroidered Masonic aprons earlier than this, including an apron reputedly given to George Washington by Lafayette in August of 1784. But it's by no means a uniquely Masonic symbol or necessarily Egyptian. The decoding of the Rosetta Stone in 1822 by Jean-Francois Champollion finally allowed scholars to actually read hieroglyphics. And an era came to an end of novelists, dreamers, con men, and pseudo-masons from making up phony translations of Egyptian carvings. Unfortunately, claims persisted. As late as 1877, the mission to move an obelisk known as Cleopatra's Needle from Egypt to New York City was surrounded by claims that its base, when excavated, revealed Masonic tools and symbols that proved modern Freemasonry could be dated back to ancient times. John A. Weiss, in his book Obelisk and Freemasonry, Egyptian Symbols Compared with Those Discovered in America, made detailed claims that Egypt was the origin of Masonic aprons and that Masonic temples existed at least as far back as the reign of Cleopatra and the Ptolemy dynasty, based on the discovery of rough and smooth ashlars and a trowel buried in the obelisk foundation. Now, I make no claim one way or the other, but it does remind me of a story illustrating the care one must take when making definitive statements on such matters of archaeology and symbolism. After having dug to a depth of 10 feet last year, Irish scientists found traces of copper wire dating back 150 years and came to the conclusion that their ancestors already had a telephone network more than 150 years ago. Not to be outdone by the Irish in the weeks that followed, an English archaeologist dug to a depth of 20 feet, and shortly after, a story published in the Sassenach Morning Herald read, English archaeologists finding traces of 180-year-old copper wire have concluded that their ancestors already had an advanced high-tech communications network 30 years earlier than the Irish. A week later, the Banffshire Advertiser in Buckie, Scotland reported the following. After digging as deep as 30 feet in his pasture near Enzie Brass, Banffshire, Jacques Brun, a self-taught archaeologist, reported that he found absolutely nothing. Jacques has therefore concluded that 200 years ago, Scotland had gone wireless. Thank you very much.
Please be seated. Friar Chris, it is my pleasure to present you with this elegantly, actually, it may not be elegant, but it's pretty rare. Proclaiming you as a Blue Friar. There's your membership card. You know, membership cards are one of those things, they're not very thick. They're not very thick at all, but after you've been around a while, The sciatica really builds up when you sit down and walk. Thank you so very much.